Welcome to another episode of Exploring Prosperity. This week, I've selected a clip from a recent full-length interview I conducted with Dr. Doris Ayarovich, where she introduces us to the concept of emerging adulthood. It's a relatively new developmental phase that helps explain the shifting landscape of young adult development. She breaks down how traditional milestones of adulthood are being delayed and why psychological challenges that once manifested in adolescence are now appearing during college years. What makes this conversation particularly valuable is how Dr. Ayarovich connects these trends to broader cultural forces, from social media and financial pressures to changing parenting styles. She offers both sobering statistics and reasons for hope as we explore solutions to this growing crisis. Whether you're a parent, an educator, or simply concerned about the next generation, I believe you'll find this discussion both enlightening and actionable. Thanks for listening in.
And if we talk for a minute about just the concept of emerging adulthood, which was new in 2000, basically, is when that term kind of came into certainly mental health consciousness. But it was a psychologist named Jeffrey Arnett who did studies noticing this trend toward more mental health difficulties, but also that it coincided with the delay of the traditional milestones of adulthood. Traditionally, things like marriage, first jobs, birth of, first child, were happening later and later in sort of post-industrial countries. Along with that, he found that what were traditionally considered the psychological milestones of adolescence, certainly like what in my generation, what we grew up with, like that during like the maybe 13 to 18 years period, 13 to 18-year-old period, kids were doing things like, defying their parents and staying out late and maybe experimenting with drinking or drugs or driving too fast. All that had shifted and was actually now happening during the college years. And, we've seen that trend continue. The really fascinating thing for me is when I first read his seminal paper, he was saying that emerging adulthood constituted a new developmental phase that went from 18 to 24. And then maybe like 5 years later, he changed that estimate. He said it's like 18 to 29. And those of us in the field started to joke and say, well, he's going to keep moving the upper limit and,
upper bracket inflation.
But it's a real thing, so for those of us who work with young adults, we see this, and I've seen it raising my own kids, and I think these are real like cultural forces that we can't ignore. And they're not just in the United States, because some people say, well, is it the United States or is it the Western world? But now there's a whole body of literature on emerging adulthood that shows that it's actually across the globe. It is mostly in post-industrial economies. So it's not in places that are still hugely agricultural or that have different but most of the world now I think is post-industrial. So we're seeing it certainly across Western Europe and Asia and some countries in Africa, Australia. We're just seeing it all over the globe. So it's not limited to nations like the US.
That sounds so amazing. I wonder, because I don't know what it would be that in the post-industrial world that has changed dramatically enough in this short period of time that would cause such a coincident increase in mental health. A lot of it is awareness. So I think mental health awareness has to be a big factor, because the stigma was lost at some point in the past between when I was in college and later. But it's hard to imagine that stigma would account for all of it.
Right. And actually, if you look at data out of Asia, so, just in kind of thinking about our discussion, and you had mentioned, other parts of the world. So I actually looked at sort of the most recent data. And again, I'm not an expert on mental health in other parts of the world, but I've read some of the literature and I know it a little bit. But I came across a study that was done recently in the ASEAN countries, so looking at sort of Southeast Asia, and it was a study of mental health among college students, and they found remarkably similar rates when they ask students to kind of self-report whether they've had mental health difficulties. Really remarkably similar. Like actually the one that surprised me was like the rate of eating disorders was 13.9%. And you might recall that was exactly where we saw it in the Healthy Minds data out of the US. And their study was a meta-analysis, so it was looking at many studies across those countries. So remarkably similar rates. What was really different in those countries was rate of treatment, and access to services. So they're way under treating. So it's not just like what's being picked up. It seems to be pretty firmly, and also stigma is quite high in those countries. So mental health issues are still way more stigmatized than they are in the US or maybe, parts of Western Europe. And yet the rates of self-report when people have the opportunity to self-report on a survey are similar. So I don't think certainly stigma plays a part, but I don't think it's the only explanation. I think we are seeing cultural forces. People say, well, what about World War II? Or there were times that the world was, there were very bleak world events that were also happening. I think that there's so many cultural forces that have come together to create this sense among young adults of, hopelessness or pessimism, to use your term. If we look at the US, there is, first it's that delay of traditional milestones, right? So the sense that you have to invest so much in your educational years and that feeling starts very early, right? So we've seen kind of a loss of childhood, like childhood play. We see that parents are very over worried about their children's safety. And we can talk a little bit about that. But helicopter parenting was a thing that was in the sort of national consciousness a decade or two ago. Now people in education are talking about snowplow parenting, which is this idea that parents can not just kind of keep an eye on their kids and maybe micromanage, but that they can actually take a role in removing obstacles from their child's paths.
This show is being brought to you by our sponsor, Trueflation. Professional investors and economists, and probably any casual observers, know that government inflation statistics are only an approximation of what real inflation is. Not only that, but the government has a conflict of interest because high inflation can be so damaging to the economy, the deficit, and our $34 trillion in debt. Trueflation collects over 13 million pricing data points. Most are updated daily to reveal inflation with precision for asset managers, governments, companies, and the general public. Check them out at trueflation.com. We're proud to be sponsored by Foundation. They've created Passport, one of the top-rated Bitcoin hardware wallets, proudly made in the USA. It's fully open source and air-gapped, meaning your Bitcoin stays completely offline and secure. The shocking Bybit exchange hack shows why holding some Bitcoin offline diversifies risk. Now they're launching Passport Prime, your all-in-one solution for not only Bitcoin, but all passwords and 2FA security. Head to foundation.xyz to secure your digital future.
And again, we're not talking about young children, which is what the role of parents is, to take care of and remove obstacles. We're talking about young adults. By the time kids are 18 to 22, they need to be learning those skills to do it themselves. Otherwise, they're going to hit some rough patches in the years ahead. And again, this isn't all parents, right? We're talking about maybe parents with resources, not just financial resources, but time, right? So it takes a lot of time to manage your young adult's child's life. But we also see, again, in the US, we've seen kind of concentration of wealth in certain groups. I think, again, this is not my area of expertise, but I do see it play out on the college campus, and that young adults are way more worried about finances. We know that the cost of a college education has skyrocketed way out of proportion with other economic indicators, so that proportionately a college degree now costs much more than it did when I went to college. And we're talking not just at the private universities, but public as well. So
And you wrote about some degree of guilt among some of the college students.
yeah, absolutely. So I've heard that, not uncommonly, that students feel like they have to be a good return on investment, using that language that comes out of like the economic world or corporate world, but applying it to themselves as human beings. And I think that's really erosive.
Hey, if you like this clip, please hit the subscribe button. You might also want to check out some of the clips I posted with my many other guests. My interviews all address the simple question, How screwed are we? We ask experts about the problems that make Americans so pessimistic today, but we also explore why there's never been a better time to have been born than today. Join us for perspective on today's challenges and opportunities.